I'm Alla Weinstein. I'm the founder and CEO of Trident Winds. Back in 2016, in January of that year, I submitted an unsolicited lease request for development of commercial-scale offshore wind off the coast of California in Morro Bay. That site that was identified in 2016 became a part of the Morro Bay lease area. 3 months later, my granddaughter was born. She's 7 today. Yes, it took us 7 years to get there, but I'm glad we're here. This is amazing to see an audience of that size talking about offshore wind in California. This is no longer a dream. This is actually becoming a reality. What we're going to talk at this panel is something that will make that reality really happen, and that's infrastructure. Because without infrastructure, things just don't happen. You heard a lot about procurement, which is also very necessary. But while procurement is something that could be policy-driven, infrastructure is a little bit more complicated, and we need to talk about it as early as possible because it's a long-time investment, it's a long-time procurement, and we need it as soon as possible. So while it took 7 years to get from here to there, we now have a very important bill, AB 525, that set the planning goal of 5 gigawatts by 2030 of offshore wind, and 25 gigawatts by 2045. The AB 525 calls for a strategic plan that has to identify available port space and the necessary investments to improve waterfront facilities for the floating offshore wind industry. As you know, at the end of last year, BOEM conducted auction that resulted in 5 lease areas, 2 in Northern California, 3 in Central California. It is probably correct to assume that most of the 5 gigawatts of the 2030 goal will be installed in Central California. So we have somewhat of a discrepancy where the infrastructure, like a port infrastructure, may be better suited in Northern California, but most of the development is going to happen in Central California. It is also probably correct to say that transmission, because it's lacking in Northern California, will take some time to develop. So just putting those things, what may or may not happen aside, let's just assume that we're looking at about 1 gigawatt in Northern California and about 4 gigawatts in Central California. Those numbers become important. And the reason why they become important is because what you need from the infrastructure point of view to make it happen. Infrastructure is an enabling factor. Without it, things don't happen. Labor does not have place to be. Training does not happen. Nothing happens unless you have infrastructure. So to support that, there have been a number of studies conducted by BOEM on the port assessment by REACH, which is Central Coast Economic Development Agency, by State Lands Commission, and NREL. While the first 3 studies have been published, the NREL study is coming, and hopefully will pull a lot of things together. However, NREL study actually looks a little bit more than just California. It's actually looking at the West Coast. And then California Energy Commission has to put it all together and come up with a strategic plan. And as you heard yesterday, CEC is planning to put to publish a draft plan, strategic plan, in June of this year, with the objective or with the goal of having it completed by September of this year. So before we get into the details of discussion, I wanted to set a stage for what these devices look like. They're big. They're very big. Putting a device next to a Golden Gate Bridge will be taller than the Golden Gate Bridge support structure. That is important to understand because the scale of the devices is something that's hard to appreciate until you see it next to something. And yes, it could be bigger than a giant stadium. We also have pretty long distances. If you look at where the Humboldt area is, where the Central Coast area is, and where the Long Beach port is, we're looking at almost 240 miles between Central California and Port of Long Beach, and close to 400 miles going north. That's important as well, because we will be towing these structures, potentially, those distances. Now, as a result of, oops, I'm missing a slide here. There we go. No, I don't. Oh, yeah, that's right. So all those studies that were done, they identified ports. And I think it's important that when we talk about ports, we all kind of have the same terminology what we're talking about. So we talk about staging and integration port. What does that mean? That is where you're going to put a turbine on a fully assembled floater. And turbine will consist of the tower, the cell, and the blades. So that's what's called the staging and integration port, or SNI. Then each device will fail at some point in its life over 25, 30 years, and you need to tow it back to port. And that is part of the operation and maintenance where you will have to replace a nacelle or a blade or something happened to the tower. But the unit will have to be towed back. So the distance makes a big difference, how far you have to go to tow it back. Then there is another level of ports, which is manufacturing and fabrication, where you put the floaters together. You may fabricate components of the floater somewhere else, but at some place you have to put it all together. And then you have to bring that floater to where you're going to put the final integration, or you put the tower, and the nacelle and the blades together. And then you have operation and maintenance port. Now, these are two different types. One is what I mentioned before, which basically supposedly could potentially use the same as SNI port, where you're going to replace major components. It's a failure that cannot be done offshore. And then another port that has lesser size, smaller dimensions or whatever, where you stage all the components that you need for maintaining units. It becomes important to understand how to separate all these port differences, and that makes it very different what types of sites you're going to have. So through those studies that I mentioned, BOEM and State Lands Commission identify a need for about 9 to 10 types of ports. Not all of them are the same. It's the types of what you need, and each of them will be different. And depending on how many of each type you need, then you can define what's going to happen and where. And the task of definition, what's going to happen where, is really in the hands of the Energy Commission. So today I would like to introduce to you a very distinguished panel. Oops, this is not the panel. I don't know how to get to our panel picture, but maybe somebody can help me. We have here a very distinguished panel. Suzanne, sitting to my right, she's a senior director and a chief harbor engineer with the Port of Long Beach. Next to her is Jeff Andreini, vice president from Crowley Wind Services. Next to him is Larry Oetker, executive director of the Humboldt Bay Harbor Recreation and Conservation District. And the last but not least is Joshua Boswell, which is a vice president of policy and economic development at REACH. So I have specific questions to each of you first, and then we'll go into the discussion. So Suzanne and Larry, you are both port operators. So from your point of view, how is your port, the BOEM and the State Lands Commission identified the needs for ports. And we know that we have the planning targets of 25 gigawatts by 2045. So with the Port of Humboldt Bay and Long Beach being the primary candidates as identified by BOEM and the State Lands Commission study, how are you preparing for the new industry? What is your view? What is the view of the California Ports Association? So maybe, Suzanne, you can start, and then Larry, you go next.
Absolutely. Thank you. And I guess I want to start with a little bit of context here, because 6-7 months ago, we were not in the planning business for offshore wind. A little bit of a funny story. Some in this room may actually have been part of that story, where you came to us and you said, hey, do you have 100 acres we could use for 3 years? It's got all these special requirements. And we said, no, we are in the container business. We're really, really busy. And when we develop port infrastructure, it's really with a long-term strategy. We know what that throughput is going to be, and that's how we design and develop our port infrastructure. So really the question that was being posed to us at that time was part of the problem. And the reason I'm up here today is really the great work that the CEC has been doing on the AB 525 strategic plan. Establishing that 25 gigawatt goal by 2045 really was that first step that set the stage, certainly for us. Now we can start identifying the quantity of the port infrastructure needed to achieve that goal within that timeline. And we knew, when we got engaged in the port assessment, we got educated around all of the special requirements and the difficulty on the West Coast to find port sites that could accommodate those requirements at scale. We certainly heard at scale a lot. 25 gigawatts is a very ambitious goal. That's how California rolls. We do things big. And so I think getting that understanding was key for us. But really the impetus for us was the alternative port study. For us, the Port of Long Beach is a commercial industrial port, and we have a special chapter in the California Coastal Act, the Chapter 8 ports. And so I've been working at the Port of Long Beach for 25 years, and that's sort of part of our DNA as a Chapter 8 port. We exist as an industrial port explicitly and we are encouraged to develop our port to service the water-dependent industrial uses so that new landfill and new ports don't get built elsewhere along the coast. That was how California helped balance our economic growth and our economic need for the industrial uses along with our environmental protection of our coastline. And so when we heard California considering alternative ports, we understood the need was dire and that it was time for us to step forward as a Chapter 8 port and take a look at what we can do to help. So it was a call to action, really, for the Port of Long Beach. And so we moved quickly, once we understood that, to take a look at our harbor area and see what we could do. We are fully booked as a container port, very, very busy. We don't have existing land that could be repurposed, but we do have a large area in our outer harbor area. It's behind a federal breakwater. It already has deep water. We've got a wide, deep channel. And so we looked at that area to activate it for a new land. And I've been with the port again 25 years, so I knew a long time ago that was actually part of the port's master plan to develop land in this area. So we took a fresh look at it and knew that we had to move quickly. We already know that we were behind schedule, if you will, because as a port developer, we've been doing this for 100 years. We know what it takes, and the very ambitious goal and the port infrastructure to meet that goal is going to take a lot of time and effort to do that. So we moved as quickly as we could. The other aspect about our plan that we tried to incorporate is, the variability. We heard it quite a bit. There are still a lot of variables out there that need to get worked through. So when we approached it, we knew we needed to be flexible and adaptable. As industry is working to solve all of these problems and set these variables, we needed to make sure anything that we built was flexible and adaptable, agnostic of the floater design, flexible to allow serial production as that industrialization occurs. We want to support that. Also, we want to make sure that we don't hinder any innovation. We want our facility to allow the turbine to get as big as you all can make it, because we want to capture the economies of scale that are going to get at that lowering of the cost of energy. And so we tried to take all of the goals that the state and the federal government were trying to articulate to us and come up with a port infrastructure to achieve all those goals. And where we landed was a 400-acre facility with a continuous heavy lift wharf at about 7,700 linear feet. It has the high bearing capacity in the backlands, deep water again all around it, plenty of area, water area around it for wet storage. And again, we tried to approach it with that flexible, adaptable operation. And as we were working through this, we thought about vessel logistics on how the towing is going to go out. So that is where the wet storage came in, the importance of the wet storage came in, as well as we identified maybe some fixed piers that could be used for some of the vessel berthing, or could it be commissioning. Everything about our facility as we approached it was to try and achieve really that industrialization, that serial production rate at scale for the largest things that I still have a hard time wrapping my head around how big these units are.
Larry, maybe you can talk about your port.
Sure. So in the first place is, Humboldt Bay, you have to put this in perspective a little bit. Humboldt Bay is California's second largest bay. We're larger than San Diego, but not near as big as the San Francisco Bay. We've been an active port since the 1850s. We have hundreds of acres of vacant industrial property adjacent to the existing shipping channels. 48 feet deep entrance. The Army Corps is dredging right now. We have 2 dredges in Humboldt Bay right now, actively maintaining the channels. Coast Guard has a station in Humboldt Bay. We're an active, fully functioning port. So what happened is basically we were a timber port, and the timber industry absolutely, completely collapsed. There were thousands of jobs in the mills 20 years ago. There were thousands of jobs, bustling. The port was absolutely bustling. So what we're talking about doing is basically adaptively reutilizing these old mill sites is what we are. And Humboldt Bay is California's most underutilized port. It's absolutely underutilized. And so we specifically developed an economic development strategy in 2018 to really target the offshore wind industry because BOEM announced, as you had mentioned, that 21 miles directly off of Humboldt Bay is going to be the Humboldt Call area. So we saw this coming, and we specifically set out to do an economic development strategy. Based upon that strategy, the governor's office and the California Energy Commission believed in the Port of Humboldt and then invested in us, and they gave us a $10.5 million grant. And so we started to do all the engineering and permitting for an approximately 190-acre heavy lift marine terminal under the staging and integration type, because we felt like that was the highest priority. Within that 190 acres, we're currently, in the next month, we're going to release the environmental impact report. We're starting the notice of preparation for that. We've already completed all of the technical reports for the study. We've entered into agreement with Crowley to be the operator and developer of this. Our project is in motion and is going. We anticipate that we're ready to go. And I want to really kind of emphasize on the staging and integration. That was the first one that we felt like was the priority. Within that project site, we're also pre-permitting 600,000 square feet of manufacturing space so that the industry, some of these secondary and third tier pieces could go in. Part of our strategy is clearing obstacles, removing barriers. And so that was the strategy that we laid out several years ago. And we specifically set in motion and went to the governor's office and the California Energy Commission and said, we believe we could shave about 2 to 3 years off the time frame if you will invest in us early. And that's what we did. And so we believe in Humboldt that we've shaved a couple of years off of the time frame so that when last year, when BOEM awarded the lease, we were already well underway. A couple of weeks before the BOEM announced, we entered into an agreement with Crowley to be our operator developer. And so we're really setting the stage to pre-permit these locations and go in. And one of the big things that we did is to sort of set the stage because, as you've heard over and over again, Humboldt is a small rural community. And so then really, how do we get to yes, and how do we get industries that match up with the values of the local community? And that's really one of the things that we were looking at when we look at Crowley, when we look at the offshore wind tenants that are going to be the first ones to utilize our port. As a small community, We are looking at creating a clean, green, modern port that's going to be here for the next 50, 100 years into the future, and really embracing these green technologies, creating an energy island. What are the alternative fuels? All of these other pieces to come into play. And so the reality is, I think the message is, Humboldt's systematically set up to create partners and streamline, and with the ultimate goal of removing barriers and shave the timeline so that developers, when they were ready, that they could come in and invest in Humboldt Bay.
Josh, let's go to you. In late 2022, REACH has published an emerging industry waterfront feasibility study. Can you tell us the purpose of the study and its conclusions? What are the next steps post the study?
Sure, no, appreciate the question. And for folks in the audience, REACH is a nonprofit organization. We're a regional economic impact organization focused on the Central Coast of California. So we don't actually operate any infrastructure or ports, but what we do is bring a regional perspective to big challenges, right? And offshore wind is one of those. And certainly from the title of this talk in terms of a multi-port strategy, that's certainly the approach that we've sought to take within this part of California, within this broader context that we're talking about today. And that study was a part of how do we kick that off on the Central Coast. So we brought together multiple jurisdictions, multiple agencies, 2 different counties and a city to partner with REACH and others to think about how do we leverage and map out the collection of ports and harbors and assets that we do have, and what are the types of ways in which these different sites can support the offshore build out, not just over the next few years, but really over the next 50 years for our communities. And so what that laid out really was essentially a roadmap, a menu of options of a dozen different sites, again, existing ports and harbors, other greenfield sites, and potential opportunities for investments and upgrades. And really, again, kind of starting that conversation at a regional level, what does that network of ports look like, not just West Coast wide, but actually on the Central Coast itself. And so what we're looking forward to now is a next phase of work, and excited, again, to embark on this as part of a regional process, right? And we have, for folks in the audience here, we have the Morro Bay Harbor Department with us. We have Port St. Louis out there in the audience. We really are trying our best to work together as a community to think about, let's roll up our sleeves. We know what the menu of options, the possibilities are. Let's co-create what this actual network should look like with our communities, with industry, and really with all our partners here today and elsewhere across the state. And I think we're going to do that with a number of goals in mind. I think obviously from an industry perspective, we recognize this is a long haul, but we have things that are happening quite soon, right? We have a survey period that's going to happen quite quickly, right? And that will put some demands on the waterfront in the relatively short term. Obviously, we have an active construction period. We're going to have a very long-term O&M period and ultimately decommissioning as well. And so thinking about proximity and thinking about the sites that are available, how do we maximize the opportunity for this region? Thinking about the state goals. Obviously, we have some very precise numerical targets that we've all been talking about and trying to figure out how possibly can the state reach those. But we have something beyond that too, which is doing those in the right way, right? When we think about things like economic equity, a just energy transition, all of these things that have to be embedded, not only kind of with the broader strategy, but really how do we build out a port infrastructure network that stays true to all those different values. For our communities, as I said, I think we have a roadmap, we have a menu of options, but what we're really looking forward to doing now is rolling up our sleeves and again, working with our industry and really our communities to go site by site, harbor by harbor, and think about what can we fit? What are the right sizes? What are the right configurations? We don't want to impose a configuration on industry, nor on our communities, right? That has to be a joint collaborative process. I mentioned our fishing industry. I think as we talk about the build out of port infrastructure in this state, it's absolutely essential that we keep in mind all of our other industries and ocean users. And the fishing industry in particular is such a critical partner in the offshore wind conversation and certainly for the Central Coast as well. And so thinking about if we are as a state and as a nation going to be investing in the next generation of waterfront infrastructure, making sure that we're investing in the resilience and economic potential of our fishing fleet as well. Absolutely critical and something we want to build in from the outset on the Central Coast. And finally, I would just say from an innovation perspective as well, I think we want to take a broad view of the opportunities that port infrastructure provides. We're very fortunate that the largest West Coast wind energy area is within a stone's throw of Cal Poly and other critical and world-class research institutions that are already leaning in quite heavily when it comes to things like marine science and environmental studies. And so how do we put all those different pieces together? That's the next stage of work that we're embarking on the Central Coast. Really invite all of your participation and input in that process. And I think not only do we want to create a model for what's best for the Central Coast, but really create a model for how we can think about a multi-port strategy for the state and for the West Coast. Right? At the end of the day, this has to be a community-driven process. Right? We can't be making unilateral decisions. We need this to be community-driven, and we need it to be collaborative. And I think we're trying to figure out, and we're doing, I think, a decent job already of coalescing as a regional community. And I think there's opportunity for all of us on the stage and a lot of folks not here today to really start to think about what does that collaboration look like West Coast-wide.
Thank you. Jeff, maybe you can talk about Crowley and how Crowley fits as an enabler of the infrastructure that needs to be developed.
No, thank you, Alla. For those of you who don't know, Crowley is a company that has been around for 130 years. We've been playing in offshore wind since 2016. We started out with the ability to charter our tugs and barges to do feedering for fixed wind on the U.S. East Coast. In 2020, I was given the opportunity and the privilege to help start up the wind business in earnest for Crowley. Tom Crowley came to us and said, we want to be more than just a tug and barge provider. We want to be, at our heart, what we do at our core, we want to be a logistics provider. So we came up with the idea of being a full-service, turnkey supply chain company centered around operations and maintenance and construction and installation. We do that in 5 different verticals. The first one, and what we're talking about here today, and what we consider to be the North Star, is that of marine terminals. So what do? We own, we operate, as Larry said, we help develop terminals in and around the United States. So that would be 42 acres right now that we own and operate in Salem, Massachusetts. 168 acres that we're talking about right now in the port of Humboldt. Port of Fushan, where we have another 43 acres, and currently looking at opportunities in New York, New Jersey, and also North Carolina. We also do marine transportation, as I mentioned, tugs, barges. That is a little bit of our core, as I mentioned earlier, and that's for the feedering process, primarily up and down the East Coast and in the Gulf of Mexico. We do operations and maintenance, and that's primarily our relationship that we have with ESVAT. ESVAT is arguably the leading provider of SOVs, service offshore vessels, in the UK and in Europe. So we have a fully compliant Jones Act relationship with them, a company known as Crest, like the toothpaste. And today are in construction of our first ever SOV that we will put in the water in 2026 for Dominion Energy on behalf of Siemens. And then the last 2 verticals, a little bit new, but pushing ahead really far, construction installation. That's really around our entrance into the aggregate market, nearshore cable lay, and also logistics around the land side and marine transportation for substations. And then the last one is in the area of logistics, and really it's about being a control tower. How do we put together a lot of the members that are here in the audience and bring them to folks like Crowley or others? How do we network them together in order to have opportunities to sell their services or their parts and their materials? I'll close out by saying, as Larry mentioned, the opportunity here on the West Coast and at Humboldt is unique. I met Larry, I think, close to 2 years ago. A business colleague of mine introduced us. And after being there for a few days, came away and told my team, that's the crown jewel. We have to win that. If we win that, we control everything on the West Coast. And that's what we intend to do. So we've talked a lot here about infrastructure and supply chain. And what I tell people, while Larry and the terminal are extremely important, the real play is driving that supply chain. Providing the vessels, providing how we're going to do transmission, the workforce, everything that we do, as I mentioned, in our strategic verticals. I like to tell people on the East Coast, we probably were on the 6th or 7th train out. On the West Coast, we're on the front seat. I would also argue we're going to drive the train.
Thank you for that overview. Let's talk a little bit about multi-port needs and how you can see the cooperation between the ports. While there will be S&I ports, as I said, there will be a need for other ports as well. How do you see this cooperation going between the ports along the West Coast? Just kind of building up on what you just said, Jeff. You know, we're on the West Coast, not the East Coast. We can learn from what did and didn't work on the East Coast and make it better. And we also have 3 states, not, you know, multiple number of states. So it is important to see how we're going to do that. And maybe we can start with you, Jeff. Josh.
Sure, yeah, I mean, a couple thoughts. You know, at a local level, as I just said, I think we're trying to set up a model regionally at the Central Coast level of how we can actually showcase that type of cooperative behavior and practice, right, and co-creating what that network looks like in our region. I will give a shout out, and I know some of the folks here have been tracking the great work that NREL has been doing, and I know Walt and Matt Shields are not here today, but I think in terms of the West Coast sports study that they've been leading, really for the first time ever, trying to at least corral folks into the same room as kind of a bare minimum earlier last year. And I think thinking about when their report concludes in a few months' time, where do we go from there, right? I think there's some early momentum and starting to think bigger. I think when we think about collaborative possibilities, we can talk about easy things like, you know, best practices, but I think at the end of the day, outlining that bolder vision for what do we need for California and the West Coast to go where we want to go, right? Whether it's climate, our economy, national security, there are, you know, a whole host of compelling reasons why we need to collaborate. And so I think thinking through how some of these early studies and collaborative efforts can kind of build into more of a building that regional and West Coast vision for where we need to go. We all know this effort is going to take a huge political lift, and I think building that stronger vision, built upon kind of a collaborative approach between all of us here, is going to be absolutely essential for getting us to that finish line.
So I'm going to expand the question a little bit and say, if we do have the multi-port strategy, which sounds like we're going that way, can that strategy help to attract funding? Because without funding, it would be hard to create that infrastructure. Would it help the state with putting money towards it? Would it help with the federal government? Would it enable public-private partnerships? Because that, in the end, is what I think we need. You know, the PPPs may be the enabling factor. So Larry, maybe you can talk about that.
Well, first and foremost, I want to, you know, recognize that there's an organization called the California Association of Port Authorities, so San Diego, LA, Long Beach, San Francisco, Stockton, Sacramento, on and on and on, and Humboldt, the 13 ports of California, we collectively have an organization, and we meet regularly. The executive committee, we have subcommittees on tariffs and policy and legislative and all of these different things. We're meeting regularly. A couple years ago, Humboldt went to CAPA, and we said we think that we'd really like CAPA to have an offshore wind legislative platform. And so CAPA came in and they said, okay, we recognize Humboldt's kind of ahead of that. We don't really understand that. That's not really our terminal, but we created a legislative platform. And then next thing we did, we created an offshore wind subcommittee. And so now I can tell you, we meet every couple of weeks, the ports, San Francisco, San Diego, Long Beach, Humboldt, other ports. We've been meeting on this. The Secretary of Transportation, some of the legislative assemblies come, and we are talking to them about how California's collection of ports is going to work to integrate into this system. Humboldt cannot do it alone. We have no aspirations to corner the market on everything to do with offshore wind. We need these other ports to be the supply chain and these engines that are going to feed into these staging and integration ports. We're a collection of ports, and we're all working together. Each one is individual and unique, and at this point, we're actively working together as a collection of ports to support each other. I'd also like to go in, because I know there was one of the questions that happened earlier is, well, ports are obviously in competition with each other. Well, what CAPA does as well is the tariffs. We have a tariffs committee where we review the tariffs that happen on each one of these ports, and we have a tariffs committee that reviews the tariff schedules, what we charge to go over these, to make sure that we're not creating an unfair system within this. And so the California ports are actively working on this and working together, each one at its own pace. And so that's my perspective on how California's ports are working together.
So maybe I'll go to Suzanne next. And Suzanne, part of the funding and pre-funding will be permitting, right? And I know that Port of Humboldt Bay took early steps to get things moving in the permitting. How do you see that developing, especially for your port? Because the AB 525 permitting roadmap that I think we talked about does not include ports. It just includes permitting for the installation. So how do you see the permitting happening? Because without the permitting, you can get the funding, you can build anything, right? So.
Well, and I think it comes back to a little bit about our history as a developer. And, you know, I understand why the AB 525 is necessarily focused on the permitting roadmap around this very unique thing that's happening in offshore wind, from, you know, the wind farms all the way to landing the cable and the interconnect, and across all these jurisdictions. And it's sort of this unique thing. For us at the port, this is just, we're building infrastructure. This is what we've been doing for 100 years. And, you know, we've done a lot of land reclamation development at the Port of Long Beach. We have a full in-house team of experts that do this on a daily basis, from planning, permitting, environmental documentation, all the way through the full delivery. So for us, we don't need it to be part of the AB 525 strategic plan necessarily, but the goals of that permitting roadmap we are in line with, because the one thing that is unique about this for the port infrastructure is the timeline. So we will all need a whole of government and streamlined, efficient permitting process where, you know, we have coordinated reviews and we have pathways to resolve conflicts or differences of opinion, because we are committed to doing this deliberative review and process. And it is natural for people to have differences of opinion. We need to just quickly resolve that and make sure we're all in alignment of that bigger picture ultimate goal that we need to achieve and the timeline in which we need to achieve it.
So Jeff, I'm going to ask you.
Can I add something briefly?
Yeah, go ahead.
I apologize. Is that, you know, I heard yesterday people, you know, talking about that, oh, there's 84 permits that you have to go through. We feel your pain. We've been doing that. Anytime you work in the water in the state of California, this is what we do all the time. We've been doing this ever since these environmental regulations go in. We have systems. We have 2 environmental impact reports that are going on right now with just right adjacent to this property. We deal with these regulatory agencies every project that we do. This is just part of the normal everyday process in the state of California. And you know, I think for the ports, we have systems in place and we are designed around that system.
So Jeff, I'm going to ask you some technical questions. Is there a way that the units can be installed without ports? Is there something different if we get delayed, or like Central California, you know, there's no port really where you would like to have it? Is there some alternatives? And with that comes another question. What about vessels? How are we going to support this?
So I know there is one alternative to build without a port. I've talked to the company. It's a unique opportunity and technology that they have that uses a wind turbine installation vessel, and also utilizes larger SOVs than we are building, and it has to be in a sheltered area. Could it be utilized? Yes. Is that the best and highest utilization? I'm not real sure. I mean, I'm still a strong advocate for using ports and terminals. As I said, that's a key component of our strategy. Alla brings up a really significant point with respect to vessels. And I remember being at this conference last year and having this discussion with a number of developers talking about anchor handling vessels. Anchor handling vessels are going to be critical in order for us to succeed here in the state of California and on the West Coast. But the reality of the situation is We do not have those vessels in place today in the United States. They need to be able to meet the CARB emission standards that the state of California has in place, and they're not there. So we look at it as a company as an opportunity. How do we leverage Crowley Engineering Services to be able to design, construct, and potentially own and operate what's going to be somewhere between 8, 10, maybe 12 of these vessels over the next 20 to 30 years to be able to do the construction installation side, and then, Alla, as you mentioned, the O&M. The last thing I will add, we also are going to need barges. You also are going to need tugboats. You also are going to need semi-submersibles. Again, none of that exists today. So it's important to keep that in mind and in perspective. We're talking about ports. Long Beach could be ready to go. Larry's group could be ready to go. But if we don't have the vessels in place, nothing is going to happen.
So in a way, the vessels could be an opportunity for other states as well, right? Because
Absolutely.
it is not as critical distance-wise, and you're not really towing the tow structures. It's very different. So in a way, this is where, the multi-port strategy, the multi-state strategy could come into place. Since we have only about 4 minutes left, I think I would like to kind of go to the closing and say, if, from your point of view, what would accelerate the development of the port's infrastructure to ensure that by 2030, the planning targets are met? By 2030, not just 2045, because 2030 is not that far away. And so that becomes more critical in timeline. While you can be looking at the longer term strategy for 2045, I think we need to get to 2030 first, and then to 2045 on the expansion. And what would you like the state role to be in accelerating that development? And what would you like the federal role to be in that development? So let's start with you, Suzanne.
Sure, and I'll touch a couple of points that have been a theme for all of the panel. And it is around this timely decision. Going back to an earlier point, I am completely supportive of Humboldt and their plan. We are not competitors. We are very collaborative on this because we know to meet California's goal, we need this pipeline. And for us, the staging and integration sites sets the capacity for the entire multi-port network. If you have a small staging and integration capacity, then the upstream manufacturing capacity will also be small. We will not achieve our goals in time. We will not achieve our economic benefits. We will not get the steel in the water to get the energy, the green energy that we need. So yeah, we're very collaborative on that. To get this all going and to facilitate, the ports being the great enabler, right? The state's role in helping get those decisions done, getting the funding going, I think is going to be one of the key catalysts to the rest of the system falling through.
Jeff?
Yeah, I echo exactly what Suzanne said about funding. If we do not get a platform of funding immediately, both on the state and a federal side, if we do not have greater participation from developers and OEMs, none of these goals that both Larry and Suzanne have talked about are going to be able to be achieved.
Larry?
A couple of main things is that first and foremost, the state of really having hard deadlines of when the transmission facilities are going to be integrated. Number two is giving California's ports planning funds similar to like they gave Humboldt so that the individual ports can do their own individual assessments and jumpstart the permitting and the community planning networks. And then the third main thing is really for ports like Humboldt, when projects are ready to come online, that they allocate funding in a timely manner that we can leverage some of the additional federal resources that come into play, because the project financing is really going to be a combination of state money using to leverage federal infrastructure money to leverage private investment money. So it needs to be all of those three together.
Josh?
Sure, I'd say funding and partnership. I think what we've heard today is there's a lot of kind of bottom-up regional activity taking place, whether it's the North Coast, Central Coast, Southern California. How do we make sure that we're kind of meeting kind of our state and federal industry partners together in mapping out what makes sense, right, for each of our regions? Obviously, we need the funding to make that possible, but we really need a lot of, I think, collaboration and dialogue to get to that point.
Thank you. Well, I would like to thank all of you. Please welcome me to thank the panel. I think you touched on a lot of very important elements. Now we just have to make it happen, right? Thank you.
Okay.